Welcome to today's webinar, which is about prediction of kinematic variables doing Parkinsonian gait. My name is Morten, and I'm your host today. I'm a developer here at Anybody Technology. And today's presenter is Moataz Eltoukhy, who's a Ph.D. from University of Miami. Dr. Eltoukhy is an Associate Professor at Department of Kinesiology and Sports Science, and also at Department of Industrial Engineering at University of Miami. Moataz is also a really old Anybody user. So in his PhD roughly 10 years ago, he was working on gait modeling with Anybody. And if any of you have been using Anybody for so long, you might know that that there was once a gait example or a mocap example in the models that we ship called Gait Miami. And Moataz was the author of that example. But today I think you're going to hear something a little bit different. It's also about gait and mocap, but it's about markerless stuff. But before I give the word to Moataz, I'm just going to do a small presentation of what Anybody is. And then finally, in the end, we are going to do a short questions and answers session. First, let me just give a brief introduction to what the Anybody modeling system is. It's a software that allows you to do musculoskeletal modeling. And it's a modeling system, basically. As input, it takes motion data, kinematics, and forces, and it calculates body loads, internal body loads like joint moments, muscle forces, and joint reaction forces. And at here at the bottom of the screen, you see a screenshot from Anybody, the Anybody software. Anybody is used in a wide variety of applications, from product design optimization to economic analysis, surgical planning and outcome evaluation. You can use it for load cases and in your final element analysis, and also for movement analysis, as we're going to hear about today. A typical workflow in the Anybody modeling system might seem like this. For example, you come with your own motion data, and you use the body models that others have built, or you build your own, and then you provide some sort of environment. For example, in this case, it's an exoskeleton. Then you use the Anybody modeling system to combine these things and run simulations, inverse dynamic simulations, calculate the muscle recruitment, and basically do the simulations you need to calculate internal body loads, muscle forces, and joint forces. You can then output those and use them in post-processing, for example, in final element tools. And many users also close the loop completely and do some sort of design optimization where they run this cycle multiple times. And I think this brings me to actually introducing Moataz. So Moataz, I'm going to bring you online. I hope you can hear me and that we can hear you.
Yep, I can hear you.
Now that's great. So Moataz, I will make you the presenter now, and I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Morten, and thanks for everybody for joining today. Today I'm going to take you through the work we've done here at the University of Miami, particularly when we worked with Parkinson disease patients for collaborating with Anybody and motion capture to do or to predict kinetic variables during gait analysis for those patients. Keeping in mind that we're trying to come up with a solution that can be used in clinic-based settings. So before I start, I'm just going to take you through an introduction. Some of those basics things are necessary before I take you through the actual work. I'll start the introduction by just to briefly define what is Parkinson's disease for those who are not familiar with the disease. So Parkinson's disease, it's a long-term degenerative disorder of the central nervous system, and it mainly affects the motor system. So what happens is in the midbrain area, the cells become dead, and this area is responsible for producing dopamine. And dopamine, it's basically a chemical that sends the signals that control movement. The problem with Parkinson's disease, it's actually a widespread disease. It affects 10 million people worldwide. And in the United States alone, there are like 1 million people living with the disease, and with 60,000 people diagnosed every year. In addition to the effect of the disease and quality of life, the disease also comes with a cost. So the cost, the direct and indirect cost of the disease in the United States, it's around $52 billion per year. That includes like treatment, social security payment, and loss of income. So when it comes to the disease, there are some main features or characteristics related to motor impairment, like tremor, rigidity, balance, impaired balance, and short steps. There are some well-known characteristics like or phenomena like freeze of gait, where people tend to have difficulty initiating gait steps, and they kind of stuck in the middle of walking and cannot initiate gait, for example. The disease itself is actually progress over time. It's 5 different stages, so it can be diagnosed with stage 1 or 2, but over the time you would progress to stage 3, 4, and 5, where you basically would use a wheelchair, for example.
Moataz, is it okay if I just interrupt a little bit?
Sure.
I don't know if you were planning to show slides, but it seems not to be advancing, and people were just starting to ask if it was on purpose or if.
No, I'm showing slides. You can see.
Okay. Yeah, we can see the first one and then the PowerPoint, but it doesn't seem like we see the rest.
You can see it?
Yeah, it seems to work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, as I said, I was just going through what is the disease, and as you can see the slide, I mentioned the mid area and the brain where it's get affected by the disease, and how it causes the lack of producing enough dopamine, as I said, which is the chemical send signal to the control movement, and how the Parkinson disease, as I said, affect 10 million people worldwide, and it's widespread in the United States, and the effect of it on the quality of life, and how it comes with a cost to the people, or to the patients, and to the economy of the country itself. And as I mentioned here, those are basically the common characteristics of the motor impairment that comes with the disease, as far as the rigidity, tremor, as I said, freeze of gait, and how the disease of progress in 5 different stages. So this is where I stopped. So you can see my screen now, right?
Yeah, we see it. We see it fine.
Perfect. Okay, so basically, when it comes to assessment of the disease, usually clinicians use subjective methods. So believe it or not, when they try to evaluate how their patients progress and improve with the intervention, or over time, they use like their own experience, or just like to visualize how their patients are walking. Is it getting better or not, using subjective measures, using self-reports, or some questionnaires, and things like UPDRS scales. So up to today, as we speak, this is how clinicians evaluate their patients over time. So this is fine, yet we cannot quantify the progress of the disease. And if there's a clinical intervention, we cannot quantify the improvement because of this intervention, as well as we cannot quantify or measure kinematic and kinetic outcome measures using those subjective measures. Traditionally, 3D motion capture can be a solution that provide quantitative assessment of gait. As you all know, it can be used to measure kinematics and kinetic parameters usually needed or used by clinicians to evaluate their patients. So as you all know, marker-based 3D motion capture system, they're considered the gold standard techniques. They used to measure kinematics and kinetics, as I said, yet they come with some drawbacks. For example, if we talk about evaluating those patients frequently, then it means that those patients need to physically visit the Gait lab for assessment. That's one. Also, those traditional motion capture or camera-based motion capture systems require the use of skin-attached reflective markers, and usually, especially with those populations, can interfere with their natural gait, and of course, the high cost involved. On the other hand, when it comes to the kinetics, we use, as you all know, force platforms, but also force platforms have their own limitations. They tend to be relatively expensive. They need a dedicated Gait lab. When it comes to capturing ground reaction forces, oftentimes patients tend to target where they hit the force plate, which basically can result in altering their gait patterns. So on the other hand, recently there's a trend for what's called markerless motion capture systems or alternatives, where you basically eliminate the need for markers and cameras. One of those options is IMUs, if you're familiar with inertia measurement units. Those are basically self-contained systems that measure linear angular motions, yet they have a drawback or limitation where they can be affected by magnetic fields, the surrounding, where you have equipment or something that can result in disturb the quality of the data collected. On the other hand, there's another alternative, which is depth sensors. Depth sensors are basically similar to the ones you see commonly used as a video game accessory, like Xbox Kinect, for example. Basically, these are cost-effective alternatives. They cost like $100 to $200, easy to use, and then could provide the depth data. And more importantly, you don't need any skin-attached markers, which was very appealing to us when we're trying to find an alternative to the 3D or traditional 3D motion capture systems. So how the depth sensor or the Xbox Kinect at least works, for those who are not familiar with, to the left-hand side here, you see the scene of a patient or a subject in the lab. As you can see, he or she won't need any markers. It can be there in their everyday clothing, and just walk in the front of the Kinect, which is this one right here. The Kinect has like RGB camera, like a video camera, and two sensors, an infrared emitter and a depth sensor. So the way it works is to get the depth information, the Kinect would emit the infrared speckle pattern. So as you can see here, it's a spatial pattern that's emitted, and then the depth sensor would scan this pattern, and using triangulation can simply get the depth of each of those different points in the scene, and can then generate on the right-hand side what's called depth map. So while walking in the front of the camera, of the sensor, in addition to the 2D picture, you get the 3D or the depth information using the infrared map, if you will, or pattern. And as Morten mentioned briefly, on the other hand, so this is for the kinematic part, right? How we're gonna hopefully have an alternative to capture the patient's movement with first, without the use of markers, and keeping in mind a cost-effective alternative that can be used in clinical setting. On the other hand, the kinetics part, as Morten said, which is using musculoskeletal modeling, inverse dynamics analysis, as you all know, is a powerful tool used in a wide range of application, mainly to estimate forces and joints, ligaments, and muscles. And as you all know, it can be done using top-down or bottom-up approaches, depending if you have a way to measure forces, or like top-down where you don't have a way to measure external forces. So in that case, when you do the top-down and you're trying to find a way to estimate ground action forces, there are many options or solution to this. One, you can do this using minimizing joint moment, like the work done years ago by Odoit and others, but has been only validated in standing position. Or you can use artificial neural networks, actually, and others in 2013. But when it comes to artificial neural networks, you need a comprehensive work to come up with the input needed. Or we can use a dynamic contact model and muscle recruitment approach, which is the one we used, which is a universal method. All you need is the kinematic data. So you need a way to capture the kinematics and the scale model, of course, and actually was validated in activities of daily living. So the whole point is, if we can combine, the driving force of this work is if we can combine a markerless motion capture approach or alternative with a way to measure or estimate the ground action forces, then we can go from this on the left-hand side, lab-based motion capture, where you need markers, you need force plates, to this, which is basically clinic or home-based assessment, where we don't need markers, we don't need force plates. This can be hopefully done in clinics, can be done at home, where the physicians can evaluate their patients almost on a daily basis if needed, than waiting to visit every 3 months or 6 months and use subjective measures. So this is pretty much what the driving force behind this work. And this is how anybody was combining the work with anybody and Kinect would result in achieving this, basically. So the aim, as I said in our previous work, in this work we've done in 2017, we're able to show that the Kinect can detect differences in kinematics, in gait kinematics and spatiotemporal parameters for elderly PD or Parkinson's disease patients as compared to age-matched healthy groups. So first, we wanted to make sure that the Kinect or depth sensors are sensitive enough to measure kinematic differences between healthy and PD patients to start with. Once we were able to achieve this point in this study that I'm going through with you today, we wanted to validate the use of an any-body musculoskeletal model that can be driven by a single depth sensor, in this case Kinect, that can enable us to predict ground action forces during forward gait in elderly patients with PD. So we're trying to basically enhance the quality of clinical gait assessment in those populations, and keeping in mind the cost effectiveness, as I said, and making sure that this is something feasible and can be used and implemented in clinics. Because we don't want to come up with a solution where it ends up being used only in labs, so we didn't achieve our main purpose, which is being able to move from lab-based to clinic-based. So how we did that? Our experimental procedure, we did, as I said, overground for gait trials. We did that in 10-meter walkways, and we picked the 1 gait cycle in the middle of the walking distance to avoid the acceleration and deceleration phases walking. So we did the a middle gait cycle, if you will. We used a single depth sensor, which was very important that I keep saying single, and I'm going to mention why. That was placed at 2.5 meters from the floor and from the patient, and 0.75 meter from the ground. And we used 2 floor embedded Kessler force plates. We had 9 elderly patients diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Their average age was 71 years. They were mildly to moderately impaired. So as I said, the disease is 5 stages. So the patients were recruited were between stage 1 to 3, because beyond stage 3, we tend to use walkers or wheelchairs, and we wanted patients who can walk on their own. So as I said, all patients were able to walk at least 50 feet without assistive device, and they walked barefoot at normal walking speed. So the data acquisition, as I said, we had two Kessler force plates and depth sensor. So to the left-hand side, as you can see, this is a PD patient walking in front of the Kinect sensor in the lab. So what you see here, it's basically the depth information, the depth data. So in addition to the 2D trajectories, we also getting this depth information from the Kinect. So this data analysis workflow is, as you can see here, to the left-hand side, this is basically after we get, this is the post-processing of the data we get from the Kinect. So this is a PD patient, she's walking in front of the sensor, and what you see here is the depth information, the 3D information we get by just walking in front of the Kinect. And to the right-hand side in the iPolysoft, this is the skeleton for the 25 joints that we get out of the Kinect data we collected. So we get the trajectories of those landmarks by just walking in front of the Kinect, without, as I said, the need for any skin attached markers or reflective markers. So the way it works, now once we have the kinematic data we needed, so now it's time to combine the two, the Kinect information and antibody work. So, and the musculoskeletal modeling phase, the antibody model is to be driven by the Kinect or the depth sensor. So for that, we use the antibody full body template using 20 lower extremity model, a delta shoulder and elbow model, and model scaling and kinematic analysis was the work by Anderson in 2009, 2010 to adjust segment lengths and marker coordination. So once we do that, we do the inverse dynamics phase, where we can, of course, come up with the internal forces that we interested in. So as you can see in the video here, to the left-hand side, I'm going to play the video in a second. This gray skeleton you see here, this is basically the information we get from the Kinect. And there's those markers defined in the Kinect, and basically those markers are to drive a corresponding marker in the antibody model that you see, those green markers here. And we basically try to minimize the deviation between the two. And basically, once we do that inside antibody modeling environment, we try to come up with this kinematic solution analysis driven by the Kinect. Once we do so, then just like any other antibody model, we can do our inverse dynamics modeling to come up with the internal forces we need. So what you see here in the bottom, it's basically the ground reaction force prediction that I mentioned. So how we did that? It's basically the prediction was based on the work by Scals and others in 2014, 2015. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, let me pause this for a second. You see in the bottom here, there's some under the feed, there are like some pink dots. These are basically called the contact points. We have introduced 25 contact points under each foot, as you can see here. And each would have like 5 artificial muscle-like actuators, and those sold as part of the musculoskeletal model recruitment, right? So this is another view. So if you look closely under each foot, you see those pink points, and those are basically the contact points. And these points would be part of the muscle recruitment algorithm, like solving when we solve the inverse dynamics model. So, so bottom line is we come up, or once we have this gray skeleton that you see here that we develop, or acquire using Kinect. Then in the antibody environment, this skeleton would drive the antibody model for us to run the prediction and get the ground action forces and basically or ultimately get all the internal joint forces and moments we interested in, like any other antibody model. As part of the prediction or process, we define things called contact parameters. So these are things, for example, if you look closely at the foot gets into this gray zone, this is defined the force plate or the ground, if you will. So there are some parameters, those are kind of some inputs you need to set up as far as, like, for example, Z limit, the maximum force threshold. Z limit, it's basically define how many millimeters we define when actual contact takes place or trigger contact. V limit, it's basically the minimum velocity, which both would tell when a contact took place. So we define contact when node is inside the contact area by defining this Z limit, and node has a velocity small, which is the V limit. And also the transition, on and off transition, instead of using this like blue on and off transition, there was the smooth on and off transition, like to define the heel strike and to off. So a transition smoothing algorithm was used also to better or further improve the model as a prediction. So as far as the results go, I'm just going to show you like the ground reaction forces that we obtained using the antibody as compared to the force plate, to the predicted versus the measured ground reaction forces. So as far as the vertical ground reaction forces, there is small magnitude, as you can see here in the table. We were interested in the peak forces. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. You can see like they're very close as far as the pattern goes. As far as the peak goes, you can see here in the table, V1 and V2. In the table, you see the measured versus the predicted. So as far as the magnitude, there are small differences. But as far as the agreement and consistency, we had poor agreement and consistency between the two, the measured and predicted, as you can see here in the table, for the vertical ground reaction forces. As far as the anterior posterior ground reaction forces, again, the patterns were very close and the magnitudes were close, not as the vertical ground reaction forces, and we got good agreement and excellent consistency in both peak points. Mediolateral ground reaction forces, we had greater deviation between the two, and I'm going to talk about why the mediolateral ground reaction force prediction wasn't as accurate as the vertical and anterior posterior ground reaction forces. So as I mentioned, the peak ground reaction forces and the vertical ground reaction forces in particular, this is a measure sensitive to the progressive changes in the gait pattern of the disease. So this is, clinically speaking, this is a very important outcome measure that to evaluate the progress of the disease. Clinicians are always after this. That's why we focus on this. So for example, with the disease, usually the second peak in the ground action forces would reduce. Also, as I said, the plots were, or the patterns were very similar, especially the vertical ground action forces and the anterior posterior one. The maximum difference between the both were 8.3%. We had higher overestimation in the anterior posterior component. So the mediolateral ground reaction force, the predicted one, was less consistent as compared to the measured one, as I mentioned, and this can be explained by the absence of inversion, eversion kinematics driver in the foot model that we used. Another thing to keep in mind that the difference between our predicted ground reaction forces and measured ground reaction forces in the vertical direction, range between 0.02 and 0.15 Newton per body weight, so normalized forces. And to the best, to put this in clinical perspective, if you will, we couldn't find any what's called minimal clinically accepted error. Usually, this is an established value for you to compare where you stand as far as clinical application goes. Your results stand as far as when applying this in clinical applications, right? So as far as Parkinsonian gait, there was no such value that's established. So for us to see where we stand, what we've done is we used a public gait database, the one that's here in the bottom, which basically had the vertical ground reaction force data for 93 Parkinson's disease patients and 73 healthy elderly patients. And we try to calculate the average difference between both and see the error we came up with in our methodology as compared to the average difference between the two populations. So the estimated average of the normalized vertical ground reaction forces was 0.51 Newton per body weight. So as you can see, the maximum error in our prediction approach was threefold less than the average difference between the two, which will give us an idea that basically the proposed approach can detect deviations in the clinically relevant ground reaction forces values. So as the discussion and conclusion goes, the estimation basically of the peak ground reaction forces are highly dependent on the force component. So vertical, as far as anterior, posterior, and medial lateral, it varies. This can be due to the signal to noise ratio, or for example, can be because of us using the sample knee model, hinge model, and foot model, as I mentioned, did also include the inversion eversion. So areas to improve in the future is to use more detailed knee and foot model. Also the contact parameters, as I mentioned, can be also changed or improved further to come up with a better way to improve those inputs that would result in a better prediction. Overall, the observed ground action force outcome measure indicated that the altered joint loading pattern, which basically can enable better understanding of the gait dysfunction PD patients. A ground reaction force prediction using the depth sensors has a potential to be used in clinical setting, which in return means we can eliminate the need of force plates. And also, the ability of this approach to accurately assess ground reaction force parameter using low-cost technology like the Kinect or depth sensors in general, that doesn't require outfitting the patients, which basically we talk about special population here that have high risk of falling. So instead of attach those cumbersome equipment that can interfere with their normal gait, it's basically a huge advance in this area of research. So I just want to conclude this by saying that the work we've done is now or has been used in the our Department of Neurology in Miller School of Medicine. So as you can see in the picture here, this is the Kinect used in the Department of Neurology in one of the clinics in the hallway. And this is an actual PD patient. He just like after he's done seeing the physician, the neurologist asked him to do the time up and go. So the chair over there, he would just like perform the time up and go in front of the Kinect. And after he leaves, we can get the data and give the physician more quantitative evaluation of the patient. And also, we're planning to work on getting this depth sensors or Kinect or any alternative depth sensor that's available now in the market to do home-based evaluations. And also, at the end, I would invite you all to, if you need more information, to read our latest paper just published a few weeks ago, where we used actually this model to compare the kinetic variables between PD patient and healthy age-matched control group. And also, those who are interested in the model, you can find the model in this link. You can download and start use the model. And I would also like to say that this work was funded by the Parkinson's Foundations here at the United States. So thank you all for listening, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you might have or things I maybe missed during my talk. So I'll give it back to Martin.
Thanks a lot, Moataz. That was a really, really interesting talk. Before we are done, I'd like to say a few words. If you want to know more about the Anybody software or other things, you can find things on our website. It's anybodytech.com. There are future events, dates for different things, conferences that we're participating in. You can also find a publication list in there, which is a really useful thing. There's also a website called anyscript.org, which is sort of a community website for people doing AnyScript modeling. And in there you will find a wiki, a forum, and a link to the repository sites. And the forum is a new forum that we launched this year, and it's a really good place to ask questions and get help from other users if you're just getting started with anybody, but also if you're an advanced user. Yeah, this is a small screenshot from our forum. Then finally, events. 13th of March to the 1st of April, we'll be at Vericon, so you can meet us there, which is a conference on wearable robotics. And finally, if you want to meet us, for example, at Vericon, or just have questions, please send us an email, and you can find us at sales@anybodytech.com. And I think this brings us to the end and to the questions. So Moataz, I think I'll take some of the questions first, if you're ready. So one of the questions we got in is questions about middleware, or what you use to get from the data you had from the Kinect sensor and until you got it into anybody.
Sure.
And one of those questions is also mentioning whether you use the Kinect SDK directly, or you're using some sort of other software in order to sort of adapt the model into the image or onto the image.
Yeah.
Maybe you can enlighten us a little bit.
Sure. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, perfect. So what you see here in the left-hand side is the depth sensor data is from the Kinect, right? For our previous work, we just used the depth data to using MATLAB and to get the trajectories from the depth information to get and those landmarks to do the kinematic analysis and also the SDK, right? But for this particular project, as you can see here, the screen you see on the left-hand side, this is, or on the right-hand side, this is basically the post-processing to export this landmark or skeleton or stick figure that anybody model can recognize. It had to be in a certain format, and for us to do that, we use the software called IPySoft, and that's why you see IPySoft. And this is basically the post-processing software that was used to generate this same stick figure that you can get in the with the SDK, but that's in the format where the anybody model can recognize. Then we use some MATLAB macros to put those inputs in anybody that can drive the anybody model.
Yeah, I can maybe elaborate at least on the anybody part, because
Sure.
I know that we are reading in, or you're probably reading in these BVH files, which are sort of a stick figure files that you also would export if you were using IMU systems like Xsense and these kind of things. And I think IPySoft, is that correct? It's sort of like a third-party software that can work with the Kinect data.
Yeah. So actually, if you're interested, you basically can download the model and get the trial version of the software, try things out. If you think you're getting what you need, you can then buy the software. They have like student version. You can buy like a year, 3 years, whatever.
Yeah. So, but you also mentioned the fact that you were using only one camera and that was important.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, a similar work was done by Michael Skipper Anderson and Scales a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken. But in their work, they used two Kinect cameras or depth sensors. So in this work, we wanted to go from two Kinect sensors or two depth sensor to single sensor for two reasons. One, our goal is to use this in clinical settings, right? So as you saw in the picture here, most likely you're going to have this in a hallway or an examination room or something. So you won't have first the space for you to do like two cameras that few meters apart. Then second, for you to use two cameras, this requires calibration. So like the same way you do with like Vicon or something, you need to calibrate the system. When you use two Kinect sensors, you need to calibrate the system so they kind of both looking at the same thing, the same way you do with Vicon or whatever. And if we interested in doing this in clinical settings, there's no way that a physician will leave what he need to do and calibrate the system before he see a physician, his patient, right? So we really wanted to see what the max we can do with a single depth sensor, because ultimately that's what we wanted to do. And third reason is if we want to do this in home-based settings, then again, you cannot ask those elderly populations to set up two Kinect sensors and then calibrate the sensors and walk in front of the sensor. This won't happen. But this way, with this approach, all you have to do is just put the camera on the TV table or something and walk in front of the sensor, and that's it.
Yeah. Let's take another question from one of our listeners. So this question is like this: many of the PDRPS patients are either fine motor skills, the test that they do on these kind of patients are either fine motor skills or movement that include human object interactions, such as like folding towels, screws, nuts, drinking from bottles, such. And this asker is saying that a depth camera cannot handle occlusions and self-occlusions, for example, from human object interactions very well. So how do you think of a solution for these kind of things, or is it even relevant?
Sure, I have two things to say about this. So as far as inclusion, and this is what two depth sensors can help, right? And that's kind of what Michael Skipper used. And if we need to do this in a lab where we have like really the patients come in and do it in the lab, then yes. But as far as like fine motor and things done like finger tracking or hand or something, we actually been also doing similar work with the Department of Neurology using Leap Motion depth sensor, if you're familiar with. So Leap Motion, if you look it up, it's similar to the Kinect. It's a very small depth sensor, like maybe 10 centimeters long, where it's used for hand and finger tracking. So actually we do similar work for those fine motions and hand movement, like folding clothes, like you said, or this is basically for the tremor part or characteristics of the disease. So yeah, this is basically how we think about like inclusion and the fine motor movements or things by hand and fingers.
Another question we have here, which is sort of goes to the heart of using musculoskeletal modeling, maybe, is this the asker is saying like muscle recruitment optimization is supposed to mimic the function of the central nervous system in activating the muscles necessary to support the body posture and movement. How do you justify or how big a limitation is it to use inverse dynamics with muscle recruitments for simulating movements altered by Parkinson's disease, which is sort of related to a compromised function of the central nervous system? Have you given these kind of questions any thought?
This is a very good question. I think what the asker is asking is if we did anything special in anybody to tell the software that this is a PD patient, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, maybe, or if you have thought about at least.
Yeah,
what effect it could have.
To be honest with you, this is, I would say, it was I call this our initial or pilot step. So this is like really more of a proof of concept of feasibility to see if we can do this with these patients and what kind of outcome we can get. I think maybe in the future, maybe working closely with anybody team, people like yourself, like Morten. I'm talking now to the person who's asking, where we can actually see what we can do in the Anybody software that can help us tweak the muscle models, maybe that can mimic patients with certain neurological disorders. We haven't done this now, but maybe this is something I think the company would be, or anybody would be interested in if there's like really a huge demand for it, or users that really want to implement this in this population. I think currently we haven't done that, and I'm not sure if in anybody we can do something where we can do in the core of the Anybody modeling, can say, okay, this muscle model, we're instead going to use this one that mimics a certain disease. I'm not sure this is something that
I think it's a really good research question, at least.
Yeah. This can be, I think, a dissertation or master's thesis.
Yeah. So maybe a little bit of a hard question. The next question here: can this method be used to compare rehabilitation progress among Parkinson's disease, or perhaps more subtle gait differences between moderate and mild Parkinson's patients?
Exactly. Yes, that's true. And actually, we've been working with a company that will help us do the home-based version of the Kinect, where patients with no technical expertise can basically do this on a daily basis, just to exactly do this, to do like when they do a rehab program that we prescribe to them. I'm working with a professor here who is the one prescribed the rehab programs. We can actually evaluate how they improve with the rehab programs on a daily basis, and actually can quantify their gait patterns on a daily basis, and when they do certain activities at home. So yes, can be definitely. It's something we actually work on.
The next question here is interesting talk. Question 1: did you report the predicted ground reaction force of which leg, left, right, or did it matter? And question 2: what is the format of the Kinect information that was used, fed to anybody? We already covered that. That was
For to be consistent, we just use the dominant leg, and it happened to be just the right leg. But definitely we have the data. We can also do a separate paper, just compare right and left side, like do gait symmetry, for example.
Yeah, this listener is saying that. Oh, sorry. This listener is saying that there's often like a difference between left and right for Parkinson's patients. They have an uneven gait somehow.
Definitely. And we have the data. We didn't do this kind of follow-up paper where we can compare both sides, but we have the data. So we can definitely, as you can see here, I don't know if you can see the video now, but he can see that we have the prediction for both sides, right? So we can, in a follow-up, we can compare both sides and see. We are actually working in a paper that using this model to compare, to exactly do that, compare an on and off medication for those patients and compare right and left side. So, but this particular study or paper was just kind of proving the concept and see the feasibility of doing this. But yeah, we have the data, but we haven't published it yet.
We have a few askers who are asking about validation and comparison between the Kinect stuff compared to using gold standard mocap setup. And I saw in one of your pictures, some of those people you recorded, they also had markers on. So did you do that validation or comparison?
Yeah, we published quite few papers already validating. I'm trying to see if I have any in the references that I used. I didn't include any, but we published a few papers validating the Kinect as compared to Vicon itself.
Yeah. So that sounds interesting. That probably also the answers to some of the listeners who are asking how close were these two these two methods to each other. So I can only encourage people to look up your papers and
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly.
see the results themselves.
Yeah, many of those papers we did an extensive analysis validating the Kinect as far as the kinematics goes and spatiotemporal parameters. So we assess the ability of the Kinect in frontal sagittal planes kinematics for lower extremity, like for Gait analysis in depth, and we did it for healthy population, and we did it for patients with Parkinson disease.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wish I had a slide with a list of those papers, but I didn't.
Maybe we can provide that in a follow-up email. Sure. Like for everyone who signed up here, you will get a link afterwards to the recording, and also maybe to a PDF of your slides, so that they can study them
like for
themselves.
example, in this slide in the bottom here, as you can see, this is one of the papers where we compared, or we tested the validity of the Kinect to measure accurate kinematics, comparing PD and healthy elderly population. This is one of them.
So I think this brings us to the end. We had really a lot of questions this time, and I thank everyone for that. I want to thank everyone for joining, and I hope to see everyone next time we have one of these events.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.